going to be teaching you guys most of the video was made for in the remover. So but I feel like this tutorial might help you even if you have already used the useState hook multiple times, in the sense that I will explain to you guys right from the beginning what's the purpose of a state, why you don't directly just get the DOM elements and edit their HTML directly like you would with normal vanilla JavaScript. States are the fundamental building blocks of a React application. Now, the example I want to use for the state here is the most simple example that I believe is used for describing states, which is the idea of building a counter. So in this component over here, I'm going to put a div, which is going to wrap a p tag, so a paragraph tag, which is going to display some number, which is going to be the count. Then we want to have a button over here, which is going to interact with that number by increasing its value. So we'll say increase counter. Now, we currently have no way to store a variable. Actually, I'll create is equal to 0. And then I'll pass this value over here by passing count. Perfect. You see, now we see the count being 0. On this button over here, I'll create a variable called increase count. And inside of here, we're going to put some logic to increase the count and pass this increase count as the on-click to this button. Perfect. Now, normally speaking, if I want to make this variable go up, right, this value go up by 1 each time, what I could technically do is do count plus or equals 1. But you'll see that this doesn't work. Now, it technically increases the value. If I were to console log over here the value of count, you'll see that in our console over here, it should technically, when I click the first time, show 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So the variable count is indeed changing. But why aren't we seeing that change over here? Well, because if you were using vanilla JavaScript, what you would do now is you would directly grab whatever p tag is displaying this number and change its value. Our DOM application is the variable. It will create one. And actually, hook in this count empty string. If we'll keep the useState hook is defined, and you can look at it if you want to. This should return back inside of here two things. The first is the value of your state, which is being called, you can call it whatever you want, let's call it count. And then it is a function that you can use to alter the state. So we're going to call this set count. Usually it has this notation with set in front and then usually the name of the state. But why do we need a function to change it? Because although this count variable is actually have to do it. So we'll replace this over here and we'll open and close parentheses to call this set count function. Now, what do I mean by mutating this value? Well, this function inside of here, it allows you to have a callback function inside of it. So a function that gives you access to the previous value of the state. So if count is 0 initially, the first time we call this prev value over here will be equal to 0. Now, if we increase it by 1, the next time prev will be equal to 1. So what we return from this function is just the new value of our state with this alteration. So when we call increase count, all we want to do is get the previous value and increase it by 1. If we wanted to decrease it, we could subtract or multiply or do whatever we want with this. But in our case, we want to just add it. And by doing this, we'll ensure that we're altering our state in the correct way and thus making React actually trigger. So that helps you understand 0.
Hi guys, so if you are from Indonesia and if you want to work remotely and earn $1,000
state changes. Let's create another state over here. Let's call it something in the lines of show Pedro and set show Pedro. This will be a Boolean, so it will start as false, but it doesn't really matter because all we want to do is whenever I click on a specific button, that will actually create over here in the top as the example for you guys. I want to make a toggle. I want to basically, whenever you click on this button, it will turn this state into the opposite of what it is, right? So if it's true, it will become false. It does. Page, it does twice on the first render, like we said, but it changes its value, it will trigger this use effect. That's why it's important for you to put a dependency list, because if I want this to only render whenever this is the first render, then we put an empty one, and you see now it's only showing twice instead of 4 times, because previously it would show twice when this page renders the first time, and then twice again when the data state is updated on this data fetching functionality over here. So what I want to do now is I want to make it such that every time I click on this button, it will trigger this use effect. Now, how can I make this use effect already there? Trigger effect works. The idea of subscription, use user grandchild component to access this toggle, but I didn't need this is toggle as part of the child display component. I wouldn't technically need to have it been passed as props to then pass to this. So it's prop drilling because you're drilling this prop through this component without it actually needing. Only the grandchild needs it. But because of how it is set up right now, you would have to do that. But it also can cause a lot of unnecessary re-renders of components. Because remember, if I'm passing something as prop, that means that every time that value is changed, it would trigger a re-render of this component. Meaning that even components that don't need to be, you do this, and from here as well. Because now, if I want to access both the set is toggle and the is toggle on these two child components, all I have to use is the use context hook, and you will grab values from a context that you provide it with. So in the child toggle, I want to grab the set is toggle function. So I'll say const set it equal to use context, and I'll pass the context that I want to put inside of here. So I want to grab states from this context. That means that I can indeed grab the set is toggle directly from this use context. I'll do the exact same thing here with the child display, but instead of grabbing the set is toggle, I'll grab the is toggle. And you'll see that the whole app still works even though I'm not passing anything through props. Now, this is the beauty of using a state manager, because you're able to create states that you can then use in multiple layers of your components. The example we gave before is the same. If I wanted to access this is toggle on a grandchild component that I create and call inside of here, I could technically just call this use context on there as well. And usually, I'm making all of these components in one file. Usually, you obviously have components in their individual files. So I would have a file for this child toggle and one for this child display. Technically, usually, you would export this global state context and just import it into all of those files, and you would put this on the top layer of your components, because everything that is inside of it, everything that this wraps around, will have access to the values that you put over here. So this is the most basic example and explanation of the use context hook that I believe. Now again, if you want more at the top, and of previous of states, but like store the previous values of states, even though it will change due to a re-render. So the RAF won't trigger a re-render when it's changed. So we'll see both of those. It's one of the ones where it takes a while for you to get used to it, but it is great to be used, especially when you want to hold values inside of your React application, but you don't want to display those values in your UI. But you don't want to display in the UI, meaning you don't want its value change to affect the re-render of your component. You could use the useRef hook. So let's start with the first example, which is accessing DOM elements directly, because that one is one of the coolest ones. So the first thing is, if you have an input, and we'll return here just an input with a text, like a type of text. So type text. we should see that input over here, right? Now, if I want to get the current value of this input without using the useState hook, because if you are familiar with states and input, by just changing a state, you can do input whenever we call this function. To do that, I'll create over here a button right next to this input. So we'll create the button and we'll call it console log. Sorry about that, console log. And we'll pass in this onClick to this button. So onClick equals to onClick. Now, obviously right now, it doesn't matter what's typed over here, it will just console log value. But if I want to grab the current text written on the input, I can access all of the HTML properties of this element in the DOM by using the input ref .current. And this .current allows you to see all of that information from a ref. And the best part is that whenever you update a .current of a ref, which by the way is literally what a ref is an object with a .current inside of it, with a current property inside of it. Whenever you update this current,
mau cuan dari trading? Bisa. Nih, pelajarin dulu dasarnya. Gimana candlesticknya? Ada panjang, pendek, doji, hammer,
.current .value. And you'll see that when I click console log now, it should actually put the information equal to the current count. So you'll see that it will always be equal to the previous version of the count state. So it's a good way for you to remediate how your states are changing and understanding how your app is working without actually causing issues like re-rendering. The best analogy I've heard for the useRef hook is that it's like a sticky note that you can attach to a DOM element or a variable behavior reference to the parent component. So it's exactly what we want here. We want to have access to some sort of DOM element that exists in this child and our parent. So it's a very specific use case. So we use a forward ref for that, and we can still obviously access the props like this was a normal component. I know it looks a bit different because we have a function wrapping around all of this, but it now allows us to have access to that ref, which we then pass into our use imperative handle hook. And this use imperative handle takes in that ref and returns back a callback function that needs to return an object. Now, what exactly is that object? Well, it's an object consist to ref. It would just be a waste of time to actually type everything out when I feel like the use layout. So if you're a beginner and you're looking to use the use effect for stuff like data fetching, logging, you really don't need synchronous execution, then if that's the case, just stick to the use effect. But if inside these, we ensure that we have unique IDs across the server and client rendering, which is critical for server-side rendering apps like Next.js and other libraries that does some server-side rendering. So as you get familiar with server-side rendering, you'll notice that this is extremely important, and this hook that they provided with works seamlessly. It provides this ability to ensure consistency and stability across the renders of your components, and it will prevent any type of ID collision between your labels and your inputs. Now, we have here, as an example, how we used to do this is we would just set an ID and an HTML4. Obviously, they're the same since we're linking both this label to this input. And if you went over here, you would see in the element that the specific element for this input and this label has an ID of input1, which I specifically set over here. Now, with the use ID variable, the specific items that we're writing, right? So for example, if I put one more, will automatically basic example of why you might want to use the use transition hook. I use it a good amount. It keeps interactions with the users pretty smooth. It avoids UI freezing during like expensive updates, and it overall just improves the user experience because it shows loading states when usually previously I couldn't show loading states, or at least I didn't used to, because I obviously use loading states when I'm fetching data from an API. But with something like this, where I'm filtering data and doing everything on my code, I don't really have alternatives other than this, or I didn't used to. So I do think it's great, especially for situations like filtering, which is the most common use case I've seen. Now, if you're a beginner and you're watching this, I would say that the easiest analogy to understand the use transition hook is that it allows similar to something like a debounce that you might be used to if you're, I don't know, writing search queries that has some benefit them and their projects, and React is really handing down the whole part of improving performance because that's definitely something that will help React in the long run. Now let's talk about the use sync external store hook that was recently introduced in React 18. Now, to explain this hook, I made this example component over here, which is a very simple component that just fetches data from the Pokemon API and displays the list of Pokemon. But in a get snapshot function,
upload your Unreal Engine projects to the web and use them on any device, anywhere, anytime with Arcane Mirage. You now have access to the most advanced and affordable pixel streaming technology in the market. Our platform is incredibly user-friendly and 100% self-service, giving you full control,
which will also create. There's also a list because it will be the list of your API. You might be questioning yourself is, why didn't we just do all this logic inside of a context and then use the use context hook to grab that data? Well, there's a couple of things and that differ between doing that and using and videos like mine. And if you enjoyed this one, you'll